When did you realize that your partner was the one? We were living in Japan at the time. The night before my girlfriend's medical school commencement, my sibling and I went out for a late-night skate without any gear. "Hey, check this out!" he shouted before tumbling off a ledge and hitting the pavement headfirst. I thought he was just being dramatic until I saw the fluid leaking from his ears, nose, and mouth. I rushed over immediately. Despite having a few drinks, I lifted him into my car and sped to the emergency room. By the time we arrived, his clothes were stained crimson. I ran through the ER doors, yelling for a medic. A nurse hurried over, but as soon as she saw the ink covering my sibling's arms, her face turned cold. You see, in some parts of Asia, heavy tattooing is still associated with the Yakuza or organized crime. Hospitals sometimes hesitate to get involved in what they perceive as gang-related injuries. To that nurse, it didn't matter that my sibling's tattoos were a tribute to his late friend. She saw the ink and made her choice. "We can't treat him here," she said, putting her radio away. "He needs a specialist, and there are no surgeons until 7 a.m. I looked at the wall. It was 4:12 a.m. My sibling didn't have 3 hours. "Call someone in," I pleaded. She just glanced at his ink again. "Sorry, we don't handle these types of cases." She walked away. I looked around. Other people with minor issues were being seen, but my sibling was lying there with a head injury and no one would help. Another nurse passed by. I grabbed her sleeve. "Please, he's fading." She looked at his arms, pulled away, and kept moving. And that's when my sibling started having a seizure. I called my girlfriend, Hannah. She was a resident at this exact hospital. It was 4:30 a.m., but she picked up. I explained the situation. There was a brief silence. "I'm on my way. Keep him on his side. Make sure his airway is clear." 12 minutes later, she sprinted through the doors in her sleepwear. She knelt beside him, checking his vitals. Her eyes went wide. "His skull is fractured. There's internal pressure. If he isn't in surgery within the hour, he's gone." She cleared his airway herself and looked up at the desk. "I need a trauma kit and suction right now." The nurse didn't budge. "We aren't authorized to." "He's dying." "I'm a doctor." Hannah stood up. "Get me the supplies." The nurse looked at the tattoos and stayed still. Hannah didn't wait. She ran down the hall, then kicked a supply door open, and returned seconds later with her arms full of stolen medical gear. She packed his wounds, her pajamas turning red instantly. At 5 a.m., her phone rang. It was her mother. "The ceremony is in 2 hours. Where are you?" "I'm at the work," Hannah said. "Ken's sibling is dying." I heard her mother sigh. "Today? Your graduation? The whole family is here. If you don't show up, you'll disgrace us. Think about what the neighbors will say." Hannah's hands were covered in blood. "You want me to leave a dying man for a piece of paper? If that ceremony matters more than a life, you need to rethink your priorities." She hung up. By 5:30, she had paged every surgeon she knew. Finally, one showed up, but when he saw the tattoos, he balked. "I don't get involved in syndicate business." Hannah looked him in the eye. You took an oath." Her voice trembled with tears. "You're going to let a young man die because of a stereotype?" She bypassed him and called the chief of medicine. After a tense minute, the chief ordered the surgeon to move. But there was one more hurdle. The hospital required a $15,000 deposit for emergency surgery. My heart sank. I didn't have it. Without a word, Hannah walked to the teller, emptied her entire life savings on the spot, and threw it down. My sibling went into the OR at 6:07 a.m. Hannah stayed in that waiting room for 14 hours in her blood-stained clothes. She never mentioned the graduation she missed. When the doctor finally said he would make it, she just hugged me and sobbed. That's when I knew. The silence that followed the surgeon's departure was heavier than the humid Tokyo air. And I watched the double doors swing shut behind the gurney, the rhythmic squeak of the wheels fading into the sterile hum of the hospital. I turned to Hannah. She was standing by the intake desk, her breathing shallow, her hands trembling as the adrenaline began to bleed out of her system. Her pajamas, a light blue set she'd bought just last week, were ruined, saturated with deep maroon patches that were already beginning to stiffen. She didn't look like a doctor then. She looked like a girl who had just fought a war. "Hannah," I whispered, stepping toward her. I reached out to touch her shoulder, but she flinched, her eyes darting to the clock on the wall. 6:15 a.m. In 90 minutes, her name would be called in a grand hall 3 miles away. Her parents, her grandparents, and half their neighborhood would be sitting in the front rows, and waiting for the pride of their family to walk across the stage. "I need to wash," she said, her voice sounding hollow, like it was coming from the bottom of a well. I can't stay in the lobby like this." I led her to a small private restroom near the staff lounge. She didn't protest. Inside, the fluorescent light flickered with a sharp buzzing sound that grated on my raw nerves. I turned on the tap. The water was lukewarm, but she didn't seem to notice. She stood over the sink, staring at her reflection. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, her hair a tangled mess of black strands. She plunged her hands into the water, the basin filled with a pinkish swirl. She scrubbed with a mechanical intensity, her knuckles turning white. She wasn't just washing off the blood, and she was scrubbing at the judgment of the nurses, the cowardice of the surgeon, and the crushing weight of her mother's voice on the phone. "You shouldn't have done it," I said, my voice cracking. "The money, Hannah, that was everything you had. Your tuition loans, your move to the city, everything." She didn't stop scrubbing. "Money is just paper, Ken. If I had stayed in bed and let him die, I wouldn't have been able to look at myself in the mirror. Not today, not ever. What kind of doctor would I be?" "But your family," I pressed. I knew how much face meant in her world. Disgracing them on graduation day wasn't just a social faux pas. It was a schism that could last a lifetime. She finally turned off the tap and grabbed a handful of paper towels, patting her hands dry with jerky, aggressive movements. My family loves a version of me that fits into a box. If that box requires me to be a bystander to a tragedy, then the box is broken. We walked back to the waiting area. The atmosphere had shifted. The morning shift was coming in, and the nurses who had ignored us were now whispering in the corners, casting sidelong glances at Hannah. They knew who she was now. They knew she had bypassed protocol, bullied a surgeon, and effectively committed professional suicide to save a thug. I sat her down on one of the rigid plastic chairs. I felt a surge of protectiveness so strong it made my chest ache. I wanted to build a wall around her, to hide her from the glares of the staff and the inevitable fallout of her choices. Around 8 a.m., her phone started vibrating in her pocket. It didn't stop. It was a relentless, buzzing reminder of the world outside this hospital. She didn't answer it. She didn't even look at the screen. Eventually, the buzzing stopped, only to be replaced by a series of pings, texts, likely from her father or her cousins, asking where she was, telling her the ceremony had started, calling her a disappointment. She leaned her head against my shoulder. "Tell me about him," she whispered. "Who? My brother?" "Yeah, not the tattoos. Tell me who he is when he isn't falling off ledges." I told her about how he used to spend his entire paycheck on vintage records just to give them away to kids in the neighborhood. I told her about the time he stayed up all night helping an old woman find her lost cat in a rainstorm. I told her how he got the ink, how his best friend died in a motorcycle accident, and he'd spent months designing a sleeve that told the story of their childhood so he'd never have to walk alone. As I spoke, I realized I was fighting for him too. I was trying to prove to her, and maybe to myself, that he was worth the sacrifice she'd made. Hannah listened in silence, her eyes closed. Every few hours, a nurse would come by to check the monitors or update a chart, pointedly ignoring us. The power dynamics had soured. By saving a life, Hannah had insulted their authority. In the rigid hierarchy of a Japanese hospital, a resident challenging a senior surgeon was a death sentence for a career. Midday came and went. The sun moved across the linoleum floor, casting long, distorted shadows. My brother was still in the OR. There had been complications. The pressure in his brain was stubborn, the bleeding difficult to find. Now at 2 p.m., Hannah's mother showed up. I saw her before Hannah did. She was dressed in a formal kimono, a stunning piece of silk that must have cost a fortune. She looked regal, but her face was a mask of cold fury. She marched across the lobby, the click-clack of her Zori sandals echoing like gunshots. Hannah stood up slowly. She didn't hide. She didn't apologize. "Look at you," her mother hissed, her voice low so the other patients wouldn't hear. "You look like a butcher. Your father is sitting in the car. He won't even come inside. Do you have any idea what you've done?" "I saved a life, Mother," Hannah said, her voice steady. "You threw away 6 years of study. You think the board won't hear about this? You think the residency programs will want a girl who steals supplies and screams at surgeons?" Her mother's eyes flickered to me, filled with a sharp-pointed disdain. All for him? For this foreigner and his criminal brother? I stepped forward, but Hannah put a hand on my chest, holding me back. "He isn't a criminal," Hannah said. "And even if he were, he's a human being. If you can't see the difference, then I'm glad I missed the ceremony. I don't want to be the kind of doctor you wanted me to be." Her mother didn't scream. She didn't make a scene. She simply leaned in close and whispered, "Don't come home tonight or tomorrow. We'll send your things to the hospital dorms." She turned and walked away, her silk robe shimmering under the harsh lights. Hannah watched her go, her expression unreadable. When the doors closed, she sat back down and let out a long, shaky breath. "You okay?" I asked, my heart breaking for her. She looked at her hands. I'm still stained under the nails with my brother's blood. "I'm fine, Ken. For the first time in my life, I'm actually fine." We waited. We waited through the afternoon slump and the evening rush. We shared a lukewarm coffee from a vending machine and a bag of stale crackers. We didn't talk much after that. There was nothing left to say. She had given up her family, her savings, and her reputation for a stranger because he was important to me. At 8:30 p.m., the surgeon finally emerged. He looked haggard, his surgical cap askew. He walked straight to Hannah, ignoring me entirely. "He's stable," the surgeon said, his voice stiff. "The hematoma was larger than the scans showed. If we had waited until 7 a.m., he would have been brain dead before the first incision." He paused, looking at Hannah with a complicated mix of resentment and grudging respect. "You were right about the pressure, and you were right about the oath. But don't think this goes unpunished. The administration is already meeting." Hannah just nodded. "Thank you, doctor, for doing your job." The surgeon walked away, and that's when the dam finally broke. Hannah collapsed into my arms, her body racked with heavy, silent sobs. I held her for a long time, right there in the middle of the waiting room, not caring who saw. I looked at her, this woman who had lost everything in a single day, and I realized that while most people spend their lives looking for someone they can live with, I had found the one person I couldn't live without. She wasn't just my girlfriend anymore. She was the moral center of my world. Months later, my brother was back on his feet. He had a scar that ran from his temple to his crown, a jagged line he wore with more pride than any of his tattoos. Hannah lost her residency at that hospital, but the chief of medicine, moved by the story and perhaps feeling a twinge of guilt, helped her secure a position at a small clinic in the countryside. It was a step down in prestige, but a step up in everything that mattered. We moved into a tiny apartment near the clinic. We didn't have much. Her savings were gone, and my job paid just enough to keep us fed. But every time I saw her come home from a shift, tired but wearing that same look of fierce determination, I was reminded of the night she chose life over a piece of paper. I realized then that the one isn't the person who makes your life easy. It's the person who makes you want to be better, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. The first few weeks in the countryside were quiet, a deafening kind of quiet that felt heavy after the neon roar of Tokyo. We moved into a cramped apartment above a hardware store in a town called Okutama, where the air smelled of cedar and damp earth instead of exhaust. The walls were thin enough that I could hear the wind whistling through the valley, but for the first time in months, Hannah was sleeping through the night. She had been blacklisted from the major university hospitals. The incident, as the board called it, had been framed not as a life-saving intervention, but as a gross violation of hierarchy and protocol. In the city, that was a death sentence for a career. But out here, in a clinic that served elderly farmers and loggers, they didn't care about her rebellion. They cared that she could stitch a wound without flinching, and that she spoke to them with a level of respect they hadn't seen from the younger generation. I remember sitting on the floor of our living room, we couldn't afford a sofa yet, watching her sort through her mail. Most of it was bills or official-looking letters from the medical board, but one afternoon she pulled out a small, heavy envelope. It was from my brother. He had sent a photo. He was standing in a skate park, his board tucked under his arm. The scar on his head was prominent, a jagged white line through his buzzed hair, but he was grinning. On the back, he'd written in his messy scrawl, "Saved a spot for you guys. Tell the doc I'm drinking water." Mostly. Hannah traced the letters with her thumb. "He looks good," she whispered. "He looks like he's actually living." "He is," I said, leaning back against the wall. "Because of you. I used to think being a doctor was about the ceremony," she said, looking out the window at the mountains. "The white coat, the title, the way my mother would introduce me to the neighbors. I thought those things were the foundation, but sitting in that waiting room, covered in blood, I realized the foundation is just the choice. Every day, you choose who you're going to be." Her relationship with her parents remained a cold void. They hadn't called. They hadn't sent her things. We'd had to hire a small moving company to retrieve her boxes from the dormitory, and the drivers told us her father had watched from the porch without saying a word. It was a heavy price to pay, and I saw the grief catch her at odd moments, when she saw a mother and daughter at the market, or when she passed a shop selling the high-end tea her father liked, but she never looked back. One evening, a man brought his young son into the clinic. The boy had fallen into a ravine while hiking, and his leg was badly mangled. The clinic didn't have the equipment for a full reconstruction, and the nearest hospital was 40 minutes away. The man was frantic, his voice rising in that familiar, desperate pitch I recognized from my own night of terror. Hannah didn't hesitate. She didn't check for insurance, and she didn't call a supervisor to ask for permission. She just knelt on the linoleum floor, her hand steady as she began to stabilize the boy. "Look at me," she told the father, her voice calm and absolute. "He's going to be okay. I'm right here." I watched her through the glass door of the waiting room. She wasn't wearing a designer suit or a graduation gown. She was wearing a plain teal scrub top and a pair of worn-out sneakers. But as she worked, I saw the same fire in her eyes that I'd seen that night in Tokyo. The refusal to let the world break someone on her watch. When the ambulance finally arrived to transport the boy, the father tried to press money into her hand. Hana gently pushed it back. "Pay it forward," she said with a small, tired smile. "Just take care of him." That night, we walked home under a sky so clear you could see the Milky Way. I reached out and took her hand, her fingers interlocking with mine. Her skin was rough from the constant scrubbing and sanitizer, but to me, it felt like the strongest thing in the world. "Oh, do you regret it?" I asked. It was a question I'd been terrified to voice for months. "The city? The career you were supposed to have?" Hana stopped walking and turned to face me. The moonlight caught the silver in her eyes. She looked at our tiny apartment in the distance, then back at me. "Ken," she said softly, "I didn't lose my career. I found it. And I found the person I wanted to share it with. I think I got the better end of the deal." I pulled her close, the scent of antiseptic and mountain air clinging to her hair. In that moment, with the ghost of my brother's laughter in my head and the weight of her heart against mine, I knew we weren't just surviving. We were building something real. "When did you realize that your partner was the one?" "We were living in Japan at the time, and the night before my girlfriend's medical school commencement, my sibling and I went out for a late-night skate without any gear. "Hey, check this out," he shouted, before tumbling off a ledge and hitting the pavement head first. I thought he was just being dramatic until I saw the fluid leaking from his ears, nose, and mouth. I rushed over immediately. Despite having a few drinks, I lifted him into my car and sped to the emergency room. By the time we arrived, his clothes were stained crimson. I ran through the ER doors, yelling for a medic. A nurse hurried over, but as soon as she saw the ink covering my sibling's arms, her face turned cold. You see, in some parts of Asia, heavy tattooing is still associated with the Yakuza or organized crime. Hospitals sometimes hesitate to get involved in what they perceive as gang-related injuries. To that nurse, it didn't matter that my sibling's tattoos were a tribute to his late friend. She saw the ink and made her choice. "We can't treat him here," she said, putting her radio away. "He needs a specialist, and there are no surgeons until 7 a.m. I looked at the wall. It was 4:12 a.m. My sibling didn't have 3 hours. "Call someone in," I pleaded. She just glanced at his ink again. "Sorry, we don't handle these types of cases." She walked away. I looked around. Other people with minor issues were being seen, but my sibling was lying there with a head injury and no one would help. Another nurse passed by. I grabbed her sleeve. "Please, he's fading." She looked at his arms, pulled away, and kept moving. That's when my sibling started having a seizure. I called my girlfriend, Hana. She was a resident at this exact hospital. It was 4:30 a.m., but she picked up. I explained the situation. There was a brief silence. "I'm on my way. Keep him on his side. Make sure his airway is clear." 12 minutes later, she sprinted through the doors in her sleepwear. She knelt beside him, checking his vitals. Her eyes went wide. "His skull is fractured. There's internal pressure. If he isn't in surgery within the hour, he's gone." She cleared his airway herself and looked up at the desk. "I need a trauma kit and suction right now." The nurse didn't budge. "We aren't authorized to." "He's dying. I am a doctor." Hana stood up. "Get me the supplies." The nurse looked at the tattoos and stayed still. Hana didn't wait. She ran down the hall, kicked a supply door open, and returned seconds later with her arms full of stolen medical gear. She packed his wounds, and her pajamas turning red instantly. At 5 a.m., her phone rang. It was her mother. "The ceremony is in 2 hours. Where are you?" "I'm at the work," Hana said. "Ken's sibling is dying." I heard her mother sigh. "Today? Your graduation? The whole family is here. If you don't show up, you'll disgrace us. Think about what the neighbors will say." Hana's hands were covered in blood. "You want me to leave a dying man for a piece of paper? If that ceremony matters more than a life, you need to rethink your priorities." She hung up. By 5:30, she had paged every surgeon she knew. Finally, one showed up. But when he saw the tattoos, he balked. "I don't get involved in syndicate business." Hana looked him in the eye. "You took an oath." Her voice trembled with tears. "You're going to let a young man die because of a stereotype?" She bypassed him and called the chief of medicine. After a tense minute, the chief ordered the surgeon to move. But there was one more hurdle. The hospital required a $15,000 deposit for emergency surgery. My heart sank. I didn't have it. Without a word, Hana walked to the teller, emptied her entire life savings on the spot, and threw it down. My sibling went into the OR at 6:07 a.m. Hana stayed in that waiting room for 14 hours in her blood-stained clothes. She never mentioned the graduation she missed. When the doctor finally said he would make it, she just hugged me and sobbed. That's when I knew. The months that followed were a blur of recovery and consequences. My brother had a long road ahead of him. Physical therapy, speech exercises, and the slow, frustrating process of reclaiming his motor skills. But while his body was healing, Hana's world was dismantling itself. The hospital administration didn't see a hero. They saw a liability. A resident who broke into supply closets, shouted at senior surgeons, and bypassed the chain of command was a threat to their rigid structure. They offered her a choice, a formal apology and a year of probation, or immediate termination with a black mark on her record that would essentially bar her from any major Tokyo facility. "I won't apologize for saving a life," she told the board. She was out of her job by noon. We moved to a small quiet town in the mountains, a place where the air tasted like pine, and the pace of life was dictated by the seasons, rather than the subway schedule. Hana found work at a rural clinic that was desperate for anyone with her skill set. They didn't care about her insubordination in the city. They cared that she was the only one within 50 miles who could properly diagnose a complex arrhythmia. Life was simpler, but the silence between Hana and her family was a wound that refused to close. For nearly a year, there was nothing. No calls, no Lunar New Year cards, no acknowledgement that she existed. Her mother's words on that final morning, "Don't come home," had been a literal decree. That changed on a Tuesday in late autumn. We were sitting on the small wooden porch of our house watching the mist roll off the ridges when a black sedan pulled up the gravel driveway. It was out of place in our neighborhood of beat-up farm trucks and bicycles. Hana stiffened beside me. I felt the familiar spark of protective anger rise in my chest. Her father stepped out of the car. He looked older than I remembered, his suit impeccably pressed despite the long drive from the city. He didn't look at me. His eyes were fixed solely on his daughter. He walked up to the porch and stopped at the bottom step. For a long minute, no one spoke. The only sound was the wind rattling the dry leaves in the gutters. "Your mother is unwell," he said finally. His voice was brittle. "She has been difficult since the summer. She won't eat. She spends her days looking at your old graduation robes." Hana didn't move. "Why are you here, father?" He looked down at his shoes, then back up, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something human behind the mask of patriarchal duty. "I saw a news report last week, a local story about this clinic. They interviewed a father whose son you treated after a fall. He called you a saint in blue scrubs." He took a slow, heavy breath. "I realized then that we were waiting for you to become a doctor so we could be proud, but you became a doctor the moment you stayed in that hospital. We were just too blind to see it. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small silk-wrapped bundle. He set it on the porch railing. Your mother sent this. It's the family registry. Your name hasn't been removed. He turned to leave, but stopped. He looked at me, then back at Hannah. She wants you to come for dinner, both of you, next Sunday. After he drove away, Hannah didn't pick up the bundle immediately. She just sat there, her hand shaking slightly as she reached for mine. They're coming around, I whispered. No, she said, a small, sad smile playing on her lips. They're just finally seeing who I am. I think I prefer this version. A few weeks later, my brother visited us. He came up on his motorcycle, a gift to himself for finishing his final round of rehab. He still walked with a slight limp, and he had to focus a bit harder when he spoke, but the light was back in his eyes. He walked into our kitchen, hugged Hannah so hard he nearly lifted her off the floor, and handed her a small envelope. Inside was $15,000 in cash, money he'd raised by selling his entire vintage record collection and taking a grueling job at a construction site. I can't take this, Hannah said, her eyes welling up. You already did, he grinned, tapping his scarred temple. This is just the interest. Besides, I hear you need a better car for these mountain roads. That night, the three of us sat around our small table, eating a simple meal of rice and grilled fish. The house was warm, the conversation was easy, and for the first time since that frantic night in Tokyo, the weight felt lifted. I watched Hannah laugh at one of my brother's terrible jokes, the light from the overhead lamp reflecting in her eyes. I thought about the $15,000, the lost residency, and the year of silence from her parents. Most people think love is a feeling, but watching her, I knew it was a series of radical choices. She had chosen my brother's life over her comfort, her integrity over her reputation, and us over a pre-written script. As the evening wound down and my brother headed to the guest room, Hannah leaned her head on my shoulder. You know, she said quietly, if I had to do it all over again, I'd yell at that surgeon even louder. I kissed the top of her head, the scent of the clinic, faint soap and clinical steel, still clinging to her skin. I know you would. That's why you're the one. We sat there in the quiet of the mountains, two people who had lost the world they knew and built a better one from the scrap. There were no more ceremonies, no more grand expectations, just the steady, rhythmic beat of a life lived on our own terms. And as the fire in the small stove flickered out, I realized that the best stories don't end with a graduation or a trophy. They end with a quiet house, a healed heart, and the person who stood by you when everything else was burning down.